Okay, chapter 5 of Stewart Little is called Rescued. If you remember in the last chapter, Stewart jumped on the ring that held the window shade down and it rolled up with him in it. And Snowball put his cap and his cane by the mouse hole so that everybody thought he went down the mouse hole. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting a screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving it a good, vicious pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stewart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean it isn't perfectly suitable for Stewart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower him some food," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted out of the kitchen and came back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in, and it will run down to where he is." George spooned a little bit of the applesauce and started to poke it in the hole. "Stop that," bellowed Mr. Little. "George, you will kindly let me handle this situation." "Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head and carrying the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's call to Stewart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It's quite possible that mouse holes branch and twist about, and that he has lost his way." "Very well, Mr. Little," said Mr. Little. "I will count to 3, then we will all call, then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then they all called, "Stewart!" And then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stewart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am," but he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not answer his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. "1, 2, 3, Stewart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom and lay down and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when a man asked for a description of Stewart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted round to see if he could find another entrance to the mouse hole. He moved many great trunks, cases, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at a section of the wall where he thought likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's and became interested in this. He carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All 3 sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal, each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair, which Stewart always occupied right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was their sorrow. George ate a little bit of dessert, but nothing else. Then when lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and she thought Stewart must be dead. "Nonsense, nonsense," growled Mr. Little. "If he is dead, we ought to pull down the shades all throughout the house." And he raced through the windows and began pulling down the shades. "George," shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, "if you don't stop acting like such an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and it had begun to darken, and to show his respect for the dead, he pulled a cord and out dropped Stewart onto the windowsill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George. "Look who's here, Mom." "It's about time somebody pulled down that shade," remarked Stewart. "That's all I can say." He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it happened. It was simply an accident that might have happened to anybody, said Stewart. As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions. I think they know what happened. And that's the end of chapter 4. So Stewart got out of the mouse shade and he was okay. Got out of the window shade.